Join us as we dive into the history, hauntings, and high strangeness of the world to try to better understand the paranormal. I will be your guide. I am paranormal researcher and investigator Eric Freeman-Sims. Welcome to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Unseen Paranormal. Today we're chatting with the creator of the Gallatin Ghost Walk, journalist and author of the new book, Historic Haunts of Sumner County, Tennessee, Donna Lyn Hartley. Historic Haunts of Sumner County, Tennessee is available on Amazon, Kindle, ArcadiaPublishing.com, and wherever fine books are sold. Hey Donna, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So I always like to ask the origin story before we get into talking about the book, because you started out as a journalist. You've been a journalist for a long, long time. And so how did you get into doing the ghost walks and into the paranormal side of things from journalism?
Well, I actually have not been a working journalist for quite a while. When I moved to Gallatin, I went to law school. My husband is an attorney. He's a historian. That's how I got into history. I really was not that interested in history until I met him. I grew up in Texas, in Austin, Texas. Lots of history in that area. Of course, Texas rich in history, but I was not a history buff. Moving to Tennessee with the Civil War and the westward expansion, the rich history of Middle Tennessee, that's what got me interested in history. And my husband was a Civil War reenactor, and that's when I kind of fell in love with history. And now that's my writing focus. I was newspaper, magazine, journalism, and now I think I'm going to be writing books with a history focus.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's why I love the history press. We were talking about that before recording here, that the history press is just awesome, the way that they do the history as well as the haunting. So you get to learn something and a little entertainment with the haunting stuff too.
Well, if you don't know the history of the area, and you don't know what might be contributing to the paranormal activity, then, you're starting kind of in a hole.
Right.
Even if you're a paranormal investigator that has very little interest in history, that would be short-sighted, because if the history is what brings life to whatever you're investigating.
Yeah, I typically call those people ghost hunters because they're the thrill seekers. And
yeah.
Investigators are actually going out and investigating and researching. Most of us are really into the history kind of first and foremost, and then going out investigating. Yeah, it's fun and exhilarating, but we look at investigating from a history standpoint too, because it's a way for us to connect with the history, which is really cool.
Right. Well, our friends we were talking about, Night Stalkers Paranormal Research, Bear Gaunt and Melvin Brazel, they are probably the premier proponents of really knowing your history before you investigate, and they know how to do it right. Now, if you're just looking to get out there and do something flashy and get a TV show, that you're not going to make it in the long run.
Yeah, and a lot of those TV shows I talk a lot about here on the show, but a lot of those, it's TV, it's entertainment, and so a lot of them have scripts and all kinds of other crazy stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and sometimes they come to places like our crag font, and nothing happens for them until they leave, and then all hell breaks loose. But yeah, so if nothing else, the paranormal is highly unpredictable.
Yeah, and for a TV show to come and try to do it on demand, I think it's some of them tend to be disrespectful too. I've heard of the local group that you're talking about. I'm not going to name any names, but I've heard of them souring a couple of local locations from having anything paranormal go on as far as investigations or public investigations.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And word gets around. Those people don't get asked back.
Yeah. All right. Well, you mentioned crag font, so let's jump into the book. I've had some listeners asking about crag font, and so I was excited that you just put your book out. It came out March 30th. And I found it, and I was like, oh, somebody finally read about crag font, like in an in-depth way. And you were telling me before we started recording that you actually sat down and interviewed the gentleman that lived there and took care of the place for a long time, for like 4 hours. So you actually got the real in-depth story on the hauntings and stuff. So for all the listeners that don't know what crag font is, can we dive into the history and kind of tell us what crag font is and how it came about?
Well, crag font is a beautiful hilltop residence of General Winchester, who came to Tennessee in the late 1790s, like a lot of settlers of this area, they came on land grants from the New Republic. What do you do when you have just conquered the world's most powerful army, the British, and have your own country? Well, you don't stay put in Philadelphia and Baltimore. You strike out for the West. And the Wild West in post-revolutionary times was Tennessee. I mean, they did not know what was west of the Allegheny Mountains, and they were going to find out. And the government said, you just go stake your claim out there. Usually about 690 acres was a land grant acreage amount. And you settle it and build forts and start the westward expansion, and that land's yours. And that's kind of what General Winchester and a lot of settlers in this area, that's how they got here. And General Winchester was a Baltimore aristocrat. He set out to build at a time when if the people that were living here were living in forts or little log cabins. He was a little more ambitious than that. He built a 3-story structure, the first masonry structure west of the Allegheny Mountains, 3 stories with a ballroom. Very ambitious. And he would not be disappointed because his visitors would include Sam Houston and Andrew Jackson, a young up-and-coming attorney and traveling circuit district attorney, and other illustrious people that are now iconic American, heroes. So this is how Crag Font started. And early on, there were some odd things that happened at Crag Font from the very beginning of a supernatural origin, and they started writing them down. Not far from Crag Font, the structure is a cave that's called the Cave of the Skulls, and there are hundreds of skulls of probably conquered Native American tribes conquered by other tribes in that cave. And Castalian Springs, where Crag Font is located, has numerous Indian mounds that are perpetually under investigation by the state archaeologists. Incredible finds around the mounds and around the area going way back to settler times when, people would be digging around and would find neat things from the Indian times, the Native American times. And interestingly enough, of course, settlers coming here lived in forts for 10 years at a time because of warfare with Indian tribes. But they were not fighting to live here. Indians wouldn't live here. And that's another kind of fascinating, perhaps paranormal component here.
Yeah.
Native Americans would only hunt around this area. Something happened 1,500 years ago where they did not want to live here. And there's nothing more desirable than the water and the land and the rich rolling hills and the wood and everything that would make it great to live here, for settlers to live here.
Yeah.
Indians didn't want any part of it. They only wanted to hunt it.
Huh.
So what happened to scare them away?
Right.
In those times, they interpreted things that happen, natural occurrences, as supernatural warnings. Don't settle here. Stay away from this. Whatever. Something happened where Native Americans abandoned this part of Middle Tennessee and would only hunt here. But they sure did want to hunt here, and they wanted to run off settlers that were competing for those resources. So there were a lot of Indian depredations on settlers, also contributing to a history that is conducive to hauntings, because depredations on settlers and wasn't unusual to kill women and children and do some pretty atrocious things on both sides, fighting over this land and hunting rights.
Yeah, with all that history, and like you said, what happened that the Native Americans didn't even want is kind of cursed land for them. And so that sets up, a nice place to build a house like Crag Font.
Exactly. There was a famous Native American Cherokee warrior, dragon canoe, not dragon like fire-breathing dragon, but dragging your canoe behind you. He got his name as a young boy. He has been called the Red Napoleon, however you want to politically correct that term may be or not be. Right. But he was called the Red Napoleon because of his skill and his warrior abilities, and he led a lot of raids on the settlers here. And we don't quite know what to make of his famous statement, "If you continue to pursue us and continue to try to take our land, you will inherit a dark and bloody ground." Now, what does that mean? That we will fight so hard that, it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory for you? Or was he referring to some previous times where, like you say, the land could be cursed from the intertribal warfare over it? We all live on a cemetery. We weren't the first people here. People have been here for 6,000 years, and they're under our feet. So you can't just say, well, that cemetery, the cemetery where the headstones are where your spirits come from, because we're walking around on cemetery.
Yeah, and especially Middle Tennessee. I mean, there's all kind of mounds, burial mounds around Tennessee, and all kind of historic sites for Native Americans. And it was, Middle Tennessee, especially with all, like you were talking about, with the waterways and the woods and fields and the hunting grounds and all that stuff. Middle Tennessee was kind of a prime spot to settle down for the Native Americans.
History aside, however, no one can really explain Crag Font. Its spirits and whatever is there is far too diverse and disturbing, frankly, to put into a category. Yes, the Winchesters are there. Susan Winchester, Mrs. Winchester, is there. She's been seen by numerous people walking on the gallery, outside the gallery level, second floor, looking out over the gardens. People will see a petite brunette woman in a blue dress. Susan Winchester was buried in a blue dress. The woman they see looks like the woman in the portrait. Susan is there, but there are far too many demonic things there whose origin we do not know. Lowell Vana, who I interviewed for 4 hours, who lived and worked on Crag Font's grounds for almost 40 years, he has had at least 10 pair of reading glasses ripped off of his face by something. He has been physically attacked. He has been mowing the lawn and had his hat knocked off his head, just let it go, kept mowing, went around to the other side of the pond, looked back, and on a bright summer day, looks over and his hat was on fire.
Wow.
What does that?
Right.
And why?
And why would you stay there for 40 years if things like that are going on?
Well, they moved. Well, I'll tell you, Lowell, you'd have to know Lowell. Lowell, he's 80, at least 80 now. The way he carries himself, he is tall. He is a former sheriff's deputy. He's a veteran. And he says, I think I made a mistake calling them out. He said early on, I would say things like, come and get me, boys. And, he challenged them, like, I'm not going to put up with you. You're not going to get the best of me. Well, they tried. So there was kind of an ongoing quienes mas macho between the paranormal world at Crag Font and Lowell. And he's the first to admit that might have been a mistake, because you just have to read the book. I mean, it's probably a quarter of the first chapter is a quarter of my book, and it's all Crag Font. When they went after his wife, they moved off the property, and he only stayed as the one that would give the tours and take care of the property day to day. But they did not live there after the entities went after his wife.
Yeah, that's pretty scary to have. I mean, for his hat to fly off and just catch on fire out of nowhere, and things like that, and to be attacked multiple times, and then his wife get attacked. And they've also had psychics and priests come in there throughout the years to try to tame it down.
Well, I only know of one priest, and that's how my book starts, with the priest that came from Ohio. A board member asked her family priest from Ohio, to make the trip here to bless the house and to find out what it was. And he couldn't do it. I'm not saying he couldn't do it. As a Catholic, I believe he could, but he wasn't up to it. He left. He said, y'all just need to stay out of the house as much as possible. Well, that wasn't possible.
Right.
The state of Tennessee had just acquired it to be a premier, tourist spot and to be a shining example of westward expansion and, James Winchester. And it was going to be a historic site. They couldn't just walk away from it, stay out of there. No. And so, that's when Lowell's, I'll just, no, they're not going to keep me out of here. And so the tug of war began. And, it's possible that a lot of it was just them against Lowell, but too many other people have had, we've all been out. I won't go out there anymore. I went out there to do my job, to write my book and to take pictures. But frankly, I don't plan to go out there again. I'm a sensitive and I don't like it.
Yeah, I'm an empath myself, so I'm sensitive to that type of stuff too. And I have not been to Cragfont. I need to go out there and do the tour because they do tours out there. They just started April 15th. They do tours Thursday through Sunday. So you can actually, like you were saying, it's a state historical site, so people can actually go out there and tour the place. They don't really do paranormal stuff out there anymore.
Oh, no, but it is fabulous. It is so unique because, it's built in 1792. And when you think 1792, you think of some of the log cabin structures we have around here, the Bridal House, Wynwood, a stagecoach stop that's almost across the street from Cragfont, and the Wynns and the Winchesters were good friends. And I don't think there's any parallel examples in Middle Tennessee of Cragfont for the period. There are other beautiful antebellum homes, but that's, they are like Rosemont, 1836, not 1796. And so it is unique architecturally, historically, the times and the people that built Cragfont. And it is singularly unique in its hauntings. Its hauntings are just, they span the entire 200-something years.
Yeah, and that's a lot of history to have, for the hauntings. And some of these older places like that with that long history are some of the most haunted. And I've heard that Cragfont has been called by some people the most haunted house in Tennessee because of all the craziness with the hauntings and the things that have gone on there.
Yeah, and in writing the book, I have, all these people that can still, at some point I had to just close the chapter and move on because, anybody that starts talking about Cragfont, oh, you need to call so-and-so, they had an experience. It's the rare person that goes out there and doesn't have an experience.
Yeah.
A lot of people have one and then they won't talk about it.
Yeah.
They don't, but, it's just so notoriously haunted. To this day, they've had the landline, a landline phone has not been in Cragfont for, 5, 6, 10 years. But the old landline used to number, even after the phone was taken out, that number used to call 911.
Wow.
And the sheriff's department would go out there. And Lowell would say, you boys know better than to come out here. If you don't get a phone call from my cell phone, here's the number,
right.
Just don't come. They're messing with you. So that's what they're capable of.
Yeah. Cragfont is a fascinating place. And I've done research on it. I've just never been out there, and I need to go out there and check it out and see if I have an experience and see what I feel out there.
Well, let me know.
Yeah. Yeah, and in your book, you call the square in Gallatin the most haunted public square in America. And and Gallatin has, the square and the history in Gallatin is expansive, but the squares are like a lot of squares, like Franklin Square in Franklin, Tennessee, these, Murfreesboro Square. These places have such a huge history because that was kind of where everything took place. You have trading and selling.
Exactly.
And they burned down multiple times. You've got ladies of the night. You got all this history of people drinking and killing each other. So what are some of the stories that would make it the most haunted public square, do you think?
The hanging of over 100 innocent civilians, some as young as 12 years old, right in front of the courthouse.
Wow.
During the Civil War years. Yep, that would do it. And we've had our fires too. We do have some mysteries of exactly this is something we're going to explore this summer when we do some of our Full Moon Friday Gallatin Ghost Walks. And we're going to pull in paranormal investigators to try to find out why there are children spirits on one particular side of the square in several locations. What has been identified so far is that these are children, and we don't know exactly why. And we're going to be investigating that. But other than that, what we had on the square was a brutal commander that, well, you know, martial law and occupation of a town by an opposing army is always unpleasant. But General Eleazar Payne took it to a whole new level of atrocity by perpetrating some really cruel and unusual and horrendous things on the population. Everyone was suspect of being a Confederate spy. And you might be arrested one afternoon and hanged the next morning. And then there's people that were taken into the courthouse for questioning that were simply never seen again. Which brings into the picture the legend of Lackey's Caves. There are caves under our public square that we don't know how far or where they go. There is a cave system under Gallatin that goes, well, of course, people in the legend and lore, people get kind of crazy and go, oh, yeah, it goes from the courthouse all the way out to Fairview. It goes all the way out to, you know, to the river. No, but it has not been fully explored.
Yeah.
And it is documented that Confederate spies and sympathizers and troops used the caves to move about freely and avoid detection.
Is there any remnants of the caves, like underneath any of the buildings that are like bricked up? Or
yes. Yeah, there's a bricked up door in the basement of the courthouse that they say goes to Lackey's Caves. And there are entrances, let's see, I guess, southwest of town on people's property. There are still entrances to Lackey's Cave, but the one that was the most popular is by Gallatin High School. And it has been sealed up for obvious reasons. That was a big place to go and party and get in the caves and, you know, get all spooked up and see things that some were there and some weren't. And that's long ago been sealed up. But I'll have people that come to the Ghost Walk say, oh, yeah, we used to go in there and roam around. One of my chapters, it talks about boys 10 or 12 years old that used to go explore Lackey's Caves when it was so hot in the summer and the caves were cool. And lots of legends around the caves, because in actuality, Jesse James hid some of his plunder in the caves, and from time to time, people would find it, and they'd take it down to the sheriff, and they'd try to find the owner, send a telegram to whatever, say, "Hey, St. Louis, we think we've got some of your stuff." So yeah, I mean, our caves are pretty interesting, and a lot of legend and lore.
You also have a story in here from the square about time slips. I'm fascinated by time slips.
I am too, and we have a lot of time slips in this area. Some of them don't quite fit into. I didn't get them into the book because they don't quite fit in with history. We don't know what they are. You know, people will be sitting, for example, in a beauty shop on the square. And they looked up from cutting hair, and here come a group of women dressed in plainly 1940s dress, walking through, chattering and talking, and then just disappear.
Wow. I
mean, that's obviously just something, another dimension just kind of cut into ours. And it's from long ago. I've had people talk about out in the country, walking into a shed, an abandoned shed, and seeing two men dressed in 1800s clothes, farmers' clothes, and you know they're making coffee. They got a fire in there, and you know you just accidentally sliced into another time.
Yeah, and sometimes around Gallatin you'll have reenactors at different spots like Rosemont, some of those places, but for the most part, Gallatin's not a huge place for reenactors to just see that, you know, on a normal basis.
Yeah. Yes. And well, now all of us who are sensitive have looked up and seen soldiers I've got numerous incidences in the book of people that were just going about their daily business. It pulled up in their driveway, and there was a Union soldier on their front porch, very, very briefly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a reenactor. I mean,
Right.
They get out of their car, like, what in the world? They get out of their car, and it disappears in front of their eyes. Or, some women were walking their dogs on Easter Sunday and on a country road. They took a break from their family celebration, walked their dogs, were walking down country road on a road where no one comes down there unless they live there. And here is, a soldier in blue walking along the road, just disappears. That's a fairly common occurrence in Sumner County.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting just to randomly see soldiers around.
Well, I've seen one. I mean, I live 2 blocks from the square, live and work 2 blocks from the square, and next door to me was a Civil War hospital. It's in the book. It's Judge Gill's plaster house, built from leftover bricks from Rosemont. That's next door to me. On a quiet evening, I have walked my dog and seen soldiers standing in the yard next door very briefly. I mean, these things are just glimpses. They don't hang around. I mean, that may technically be a time slip. I don't know. But you see, at one point in time, there were 3,500 people living in Gallatin during the Civil War. And at any particular time, you might have 3,500 soldiers. You got one-on-one Union soldiers camped out in this town and around this town. And so maybe we're seeing a time slip because there would have been a Union soldier on every corner. That's how heavy the occupation was here. We had 9 hospitals in the close vicinity of the square. So you've got a very chaotic time here. You've got a brutal general in the courthouse looking for spies and bringing any and everyone in that he needs to interrogate and probably hang. You've got wagons with wounded coming up from the railroad tracks, bringing them from here and there to our 9 hospitals. This is a lot of bustling activity day to day for a quiet little county seat that was a farming community town until the federal troops occupied in 1862. And they had a long 3 or 4 years of this kind of thing. It must have been crowded, hot, dirty, tragic, day to day. A lot of tragedy and, right on the square, in addition to the hanging and the chaos, you had a Civil War surgery where soldiers from both sides were being brought to this one building, which coincidentally is the old law office of Andrew Jackson when he was a circuit judge and circuit DA traveling the circuit. And this would be his office. That later on was a Civil War surgery. That's not a nice little place where you're going to come out of there. Something's going to be cut off or you're going to die from a head wound or whatever. You're not coming out of there.
Right.
So that is something that faces the square that no doubt contributes to the ghost.
Yeah, and I've heard that every building on the square has stories like you're saying, and people see, like you're talking about, people see the soldiers and stuff around. So yeah, I mean, I could see how you could say that's one of the most haunted public squares in America with all of this history and all of these buildings that are haunted, and then you got the caves like you were talking about. Yeah, it definitely is Gallatin is a cool place, especially for history and for the paranormal stuff.
It's possible. It's been talked about that something about this area is some sort of portal or vortex or something, because you can just about draw a straight line. You can draw a straight line from Cragfont through my house to the square. And, then if you got over east, we've got Bill Witch, got Adams. I mean, there's almost like there's a little Bermuda Triangle, and we're in it. Awful lot of activity.
Yeah.
In a triangle that goes from Adams to Cragfont to the square and back. And then out Long Hollow Pikeway, which is Sumner County, a lot of activity, including a very famous flying cryptid, a giant winged creature that is, in history, it was called the Tlanawa, the Cherokee Tlanawa, which is like the Thunderbird of the Southwest. It is a giant mythical winged creature that would swoop down and carry off livestock, small children and may still be seen. It was seen in the 70s on Long Hollow Pike, and I've got a story about that in the book.
I've never heard that story.
It's pretty interesting. As I was finishing up the book, I started hearing about the Long Hollow Pike flying cryptid, and I went, oh my gosh. Oh, stop the presses. We got to get this in there. And now I'm just fascinated by this and, want to explore it some more because that's going way back legend. What's so hard about studying the Native American lore is that that's all a passed down oral tradition. Right. It's hard to find that anywhere documented. But people that see the flying cryptid out there also see full-blade apparitions of Native Americans in warrior dress. And that area out there, that part of Sumner County, out Long Hollow Pike towards Goodlettsville, Mansker Station, seems to be a hotbed of Native American spirit activity, including the flying cryptid.
Yeah, like I said, I've never heard of any flying cryptid. Of course, I've heard of thunderbirds, but no flying cryptid stories in Middle Tennessee. That's pretty neat.
But Swanawa is a Cherokee legend, and very little known, obviously, because I sure had trouble digging it up. But the people around the Mount Olivet community, which is an African American community with very, very long history, going way back, that is where this is seen.
Another section that you put in the book was about, that I don't hear a lot of stories about, was about log structures. For whatever reason, you don't hear a whole lot about these old log homes and stuff being haunted.
Well, there's nothing about the log structures themselves that would be conducive to hauntings, I don't think. I don't see any reason why they would be more haunted than anything else. They are just an interesting part of our history, just in and of themselves, that is what the settlers built. And then they would build on and on to them. And then, of course, we have some famous large ones like Wynwood, which was a stagecoach stop. And it's huge. It's an inn. And it's very close to Cragfont. And it doesn't have very much the paranormal. I have no paranormal stories about Wynwood. There doesn't seem to be anything there.
Yeah.
That's because they're all at Cragfont, right across the street. Why would they leave? They definitely have their seat of power at Cragfont, that's for sure. But no, there's quite a bit of paranormal activity in Castalian Springs. We just tend to think it's all at Cragfont, but that whole area is very, very, Cragfont steals the show.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of activity all out there in Castalian Springs.
Yeah, and I guess with the log structures, I guess if you subscribe to the theory in the paranormal that, these houses made out of limestone or have limestone foundations somehow boost the paranormal activity, I guess that would make sense because the log structures didn't necessarily have, you don't have all that stone and quartz and stuff in that.
Right.
One of the other things that you put in here is Ghost by the Railroad Tracks. And I've like railroad tracks, there's all this folklore anywhere in the country, in the United States you go. There's all this folklore and ghost stories, and like you have phantom lights on railroad tracks. And so I just always find the railroad track thing interesting. I know you had people building them by hand and things like that, so people probably would have died. But the ghost stories on railroad tracks, it just makes me think what would attract ghostly phenomena to railroad tracks.
I don't know why in particular railroad tracks. I just know that here there's several things that make ghosts along the railroad tracks in Sumner County prevalent, and that is the building of the L&N Railroad in the 1850s. They set up an entire city in the northern part of the county to bring in workers. Even immigrant Chinese came to this area to help build the L&N Railroad. So there were a whole lot of people living a hard life of carving out that railroad, which eventually railroad track L&N ran from Chicago to New Orleans, and it ran right through Sumner County. So, you had all the drama of human life engaged for months building railroad tracks. And then the railroad tracks here figure so significantly in the Civil War. The whole reason the Union Army appointed the maniac Eleazar Payne to supervise the county was that the railroad was so important. It moved troops, it moved supplies. And concurrently with the moving of those supplies is going to be the opposing army, the Confederate army, that wants to do anything it can to stop the Union supplies. So we have all this drama going on around the railroad tracks with John Hunt Morgan and Confederate guerrilla fighters trying to sabotage the railroads, and the deaths and the fighting going on along those tracks to try to shut them down to not move Union supplies south. So we have a lot of that. That's why our railroad tracks probably are so haunted here. L&N Railroad, the building of it and the protecting of it, or the trying to protect it from Union troops moving supplies.
Yeah, and that would make sense. I mean, especially with because the immigrants weren't treated very well from, what's been told through history, especially building the railroad tracks and stuff.
I'm sure there's graves all over with people that, for one reason or another didn't make it through a long season of manual labor.
Right.
Buried all in our hillsides up at Portland and, Westmoreland and those areas.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Gallatin Ghost Walk that you've been doing for 17 years. You go around the square in Gallatin, right?
We go around the square, but we talk about so much that's not on the square. We can't talk about Cragfont. Cragfont's not on the square. So, we're walking the square, but we're also walking a couple of blocks east and behind two blocks behind the square. And, we don't stay on the square. We are in the general vicinity walking. It's about a 2.5 hour tour. And we are talking about more than the square. We're talking about Cragfont. We're talking about, what we've talked about in Mount Olivet and out the Flying Cryptids. And we're talking about Portland. And we're talking about all of Sumner County. But we are walking the square and several blocks east as we do it. This started as a way to educate people in a fun way about the history of Sumner County. And it's just taken on such a life of its own because, you could talk about Cragfont for the whole 2.5 hours of the tour. And there's so much more that we have to cover. So that's kind of how the book came about. I mean, the tour had to be expanded into something more to do justice to what we have here in terms of history and paranormal activity. And there will no doubt be volume 2 because there's just so much more to tell.
Yeah, definitely a place with lots of history and lots of interesting history. We didn't even get into Rosemont because I've talked to about Rosemont here on the show quite a few times and about a lot of the history. But the history of Rosemont is fascinating as well, and that whole area. And just Gallatin and Sumner County in general, because there's so much history, like you said, that's one of the big places that was settled with the Western expansion. And so, people need to go out and check out your ghost walks, especially 2.5 hours. A lot of ghost walks aren't that long. A lot of them, hour and a half. But 2.5 hours, that's pretty awesome to learn that much history. And
we let people participate. We want people to be interactive with us. We walk by my house, which I talk about very briefly, and I don't talk about in the book because I live here. I don't, I realize it might be a problem when, we live and work here and my husband's law office is here in the front and we live in the back. And somebody said something about to me, your husband's the haunted lawyer. And I went, oh yeah, let's not, I really don't want my husband to be known as the haunted lawyer.
Right.
So I do not talk about my house and what has happened here, but, and it does not seem to have a history component to it. It's one of those just mysteries of what is here and why is it here. And it's not here anymore. It's outside. It occasionally tries to get in. I'll talk about it privately with people, but, it's not in my book and I minimize it on the tour. It's a cautionary tale, I feel, because I know that some occult activity went on here with a long ago prior tenant. And, it's a cautionary tale about kind of staying in your lane when it comes to investigating.
Right.
And, there's things you do and don't do and ways to do it and ways, so that's why I keep it private. But we do walk here. The house caddy corner to me has an interesting spirit. And, See, next door to me is Judge Gill's plaster house, made from the leftover bricks of Rosemont. This is a fascinating nugget of history in and of itself. Judge Gill was so politically active. He was, of course, first and foremost, a breeder of fine thoroughbred horses that ran races all over the country. But he was heavy into politics of the times. And drinking and card playing and, that sort of thing goes hand in hand with politics, of course. And Mrs. Guild kind of got tired of that at Rosemont. That was her little oasis.
Yeah.
And so Judge Guild moved his political discussion to the little plaster house, which is next door to my house. And the politics of the day were discussed right next door to me, which, if you think about it, starting in about 1837, that encompasses a lot of history if those walls could talk.
Right.
They would have been talking about Texas becoming its own country. They would have been talking about, Native American uprisings, and they would have been talking about secession. And I would like to go into a little time slip and eavesdrop on that next door. It'd be fascinating.
That would be fascinating.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Your season for the normal ghost walks starts in October, but you do the full moon Fridays, which you mentioned before. The first one's going to be on May 13th.
Right.
And then you got a few other dates throughout the summer. In October, you start up the normal schedule of ghost walks.
Yeah.
And there are two ways people can get tickets. They can go to the Gallatin Ghost Walk Facebook page, and you also have a website, SumnerCountyHistoryAndHaunts.com.
Yes. And we are old school. Anyone making a reservation for the ghost walk calls me, and I write it down on a piece of paper. We don't do this Eventbrite stuff. For one thing, in October there's going to be some rain out, and I don't want to have to give people's money back.
Yeah.
So we are so old school that we do cash on site, but you have to call me and talk to me on the telephone and make your reservation. And, go to Gallatin Ghost Walk Facebook page or SumnerCountyHistoryAndHaunts.com. And that is how you can connect with us. And we're on Instagram, but everything pretty much goes through Facebook. And that's where people will messenger me and get their name on the list.
And like I said at the beginning of the show, Historic Haunts of Sumner County, Tennessee is available on Amazon, Kindle, ArcadiaPublishing.com, and wherever you find books are sold. And I will put all those links in the show notes to the website, the Facebook page, and to where people can buy your books. But thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, stay safe out there. We'll see you next time. Have a good day. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, head over to the Unseen Paranormal Lounge on Facebook for all the latest updates and discussions about the show. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, or at unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe to help more people discover the show. The Unseen Paranormal Podcast is proud to be the ambassador for paranormal for Verbal.com. A big thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. You can find more of his music on Apple, Amazon, or Spotify. And as always, thank you for listening.
You have come to the